All right, here in the 1940s, we have the Cold War, which is in 1945. The Cold War was a state of political and military tension after World War II between powers in the Western Bloc and powers in the Eastern Bloc. We move on to 1946. The Taft-Hartley Act was issued. The Labor Management Relations Act of 1947 took place. We move on to 1947. The Truman Doctrine, an American foreign policy created to counter Soviet geopolitical spread during the Cold War. It was first announced to Congress by President Truman on March 12, 1947, and further developed on July 12, 1948, when he pledged to contain Soviet threats to Greece and Turkey. We move on to 1948, where a perjury of former diplomat Alger Hiss took place. Hiss was accused of selling government secrets to the Soviets, and in 1953, execution of New York couple Julius and Ethel Rosenberg on grounds of espionage heightened Americans' fears. In 1945, the National Housing Act of 1945 was issued. It was part of Truman's Fair Deal. In 1950, America at this moment, said the former Prime Minister Winston Churchill in 1945, stands at the summit of the world. The McCarran Act is issued, and President Truman approved U.S. construction of the hydrogen bomb. We move on to 1951. Color TV has been introduced. Shows like I Love Lucy are killing it on the air. The 22nd Amendment, the two-terms MAC, is issued. 1952, polio strikes America. Polio in fast food restaurants spreads. In 1953, financial loans become more popular. People are buying more expensive things, and the Korean War finally comes to an end. Eisenhower has issued the highway system to employ many of wounded soldiers. 1954, Salk uses polio vaccine on 1.3 million children. Senator Joseph McCarthy is censored, bringing an end to his witch hunt of communists. In 1955, the first McDonald's was brought to the USA. First Coke drink sold in can rather than bottle. Rock and roll revolutionized with the rise of Elvis Presley, Bill Haley, and the Comets. In 1956, the Alabama bus segregation laws declared illegal by U.S. Supreme Court. Rising star Elvis has his first hit, Heartbreak Hotel. In 1957, Sputnik is introduced. Troops are sent to Arkansas to enforce anti-segregation laws. Sputnik 2 with Lake of the Dog. In 1958, an increase in unemployment over 7% was introduced. NASA was finally formed to expand the knowledge of space, and 14-year-old Bobby Fischer wins the United States Chess Championship. In 1959, Alaska and Hawaii become the 49th and 50th states of the U.S. The Boeing 707 jetliner in service, Barbie dolls were created, and Fidel Castro takes control of Cuba. In 1960, the free speech movement occurred. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson won the presidency and were sworn into the Oval Office. In 1961, the Berlin Wall was enforced that completely cut off West Germany from East Germany. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, when the U.S. accused Soviets of having nuclear weapons in Cuba. In 1963, JFK was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. Now in 1964, we see the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This was an act to enforce the constitutional right to vote, to confer jurisdiction upon the district courts of the United States of America, and to provide injunctive relief against discrimination in public accommodations. In 1965, we have the Civil Rights Act of 1965. This aimed to overcome legal barriers at the state and local levels that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote under the 15th Amendment. In 1966, the year of escalation took place. Many more soldiers were deployed into Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson was hated by many. In 1967, the summer of love, when young teenagers got friendly and smoked pot and grooved to the music of the Grateful Dead. Interracial marriage is declared constitutional by the Supreme Court in the Loving v. In 1968, the Civil Rights of 1968 occurred. These civil rights, popularly known as the Fair Housing Act, prohibited discrimination concerning the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. Then came the Beat Generation in 1969, a group of authors who literature explored and influenced American culture in the post-World War II era. The bulk of their work was published and popularized throughout the 1950s. We see events like Woodstock occurring as well. In 1970, U.S. Voting Rights Act of 1970 took place, which proposed a lowered voting age. In 1971, the age of voting is now lowered to 18 in the U.S. when 26th Amendment is passed. In 1972, you see the Watergate scandal. In 1973, it's the Roe v. Wade making abortion U.S. constitutional right. Then, in 1974, the famous skeleton Lucy is discovered in Ethiopia, which lived between 3.9 to 3 million years ago. After the findings of the Watergate scandal, Richard Nixon becomes the first U.S. president forced to resign from office. In 1975, Bill Gates and Paul Allen create the company Microsoft. The Vietnam War finally comes to a close. In 1976, Apple is formed by Steve Jobs and Steve Wozniak. The first punk bands emerge. In 1977, Jimmy Carter is elected as president. Elvis died at the age of 42 on the toilet. In 1978, first ever cellular mobile phones were created. The Saturday Night Movie Fever is a blockbuster and captures disco culture. In 1979, Sony released the Walkman, a worldwide success. ESPN launches on cable TV. In 1980, John Lennon is shot to death on December of 1980 by Mark David Chapman outside of his New York apartment. In 1981, the wreck of the Titanic was found. In 1982, the cost of living increased. Yearly inflation became 6.16%. Now in 1983, Microsoft Word is launched. In 1984, Apple releases the Macintosh computer. We move on to 1985, which has the first hijack of TWA Flight 847. In 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger explodes shortly after takeoff as people watched live on TV around the globe. In 1987, U.S. stock market drops 22.6% in one day. In 1988, the Hubble Space Telescope goes into operation to explore deep space and is still in full use today, mapping our universe. And finally, in 1989, massive protests against the Berlin Wall, bringing about the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and the East German government both are dismantled, which leads after many years to the reunification of East and West Germany.